Star Wars, for a lot of people, began here, for I'd say most of the world, and with good reason. Obviously, these were the first films released. The first thing anybody ever knew about Star Wars was what later became known as Episode 4, A New Hope. And these are still the highest rated films from fans and critics alike. But with all the new Star Wars content we've gotten over the years, the question becomes, is the original era still the golden era, or are we all blinded by nostalgia? So to answer that question, I watched all these films again, for only like the 100th time, but I tried to go in with a different view. Forget everything that I know and love about this era of movies and shows, and judge this purely from a storytelling standpoint. That being, how interesting and captivating is this era in general? Are the characters really that well written? How about the plot elements and the beats of the story? And as I'm talking about this era of Star Wars, I'm going to be talking about a few different things. Not all of these things, but that'll come in a different video. I wanted to try and find a way to separate these things out sorta evenly, and one of the spin-off shows that we first got was Star Wars Rebels. So I'm also going to be talking about that again in regards to the story and how it adds to this time frame of the universe. Also included is going to be Rogue One. Considering that movie ends minutes before the start of A New Hope, it's only fitting that I discuss it here too. So grab your blue milk, relax in your X-Wing, and let's talk the original era of Star Wars. So whenever I think about A New Hope, my mind goes to the most basic movie I can think of, and I don't mean that in a bad way. This film follows the structure of the hero's journey, a formula laid out by Joseph Campbell that just about any movie you can think of follows. The only thing about A New Hope is that it does it with absolutely no flaws whatsoever. So let's follow the hero's journey, shall we? We're introduced to our main character, their day-to-day life.
I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters.
Until they meet an old, wise mentor that tells them about their destiny or the journey that they're about to go on. The hero refuses at first, until they agree because of the inciting incident, that being Princess Leia's call for help. The mentor gives the hero some sort of supernatural or powerful aid, and they bring them outside of their normal, comfortable life. The hero meets new allies and enemies, goes through difficult tasks that change them until there's a metaphorical or actual death. This changes the hero as they prepare for their biggest task in the story, but this task also seems insurmountable. But using everything that they've learned throughout the course of the movie, the hero ultimately prevails and returns home with their supernatural aid, having learned something about themselves on this journey. So Luke doesn't return to Tatooine here, but everything else is exactly as it's laid out. Not to be that guy, but I did go to film school, and this film was brought up, I kid you not, in every single class I ever took. Whether it be writing and talking about the hero's journey, editing, where they talked about the pacing of this movie and how the original edit of the film was awful, which it was, directing classes because of Alec Guinness's performance as a deeply troubled man with a dark history that would perfectly set up Ewan's portrayal of the character years later. Whatever it might have been, Star Wars or Episode 4 A New Hope was always brought up as an example of a movie that is good on all fronts. And I absolutely believe that, having watched it again with the lens like I'm watching it for the first time. The structure and editing is perfectly sound, but where this movie really excels are the characters. You have a sympathetic hero that's easy to root for, that the audience can see themselves in with Luke Skywalker. You have a wise mentor with Ben Kenobi, who teaches Luke about this cool and mysterious Jedi Order, who have these laser swords and special powers. We know that all of this exists because we've seen Ben Kenobi do some cool things like mind control a stormtrooper, but the cool guy in the movie, Han Solo, doesn't really believe in it. Han Solo adds the cool bad boy aspect of the film and absolutely nails it. He shoots first, talks later, looks out for himself, and throws in good one-liners.
But everything's perfectly all right now. We're fine. We're all fine here now. Thank you. How are you?
Han could have easily just been that character, but he also has his own character development throughout the film, learning to help other people that he cares about rather than just looking out for himself. Then we have Princess Leia, who isn't the type of character you'd think of when you hear the word princess. She's rebellious, headstrong, intelligent, and sticks up for what she believes in. She's kind of this weird opposite version of Luke Skywalker in a way, but that's probably just a coincidence. Even the supporting characters like R2, C-3PO, and Chewbacca add the perfect amount of comedic relief and heartwarming moments to the film. So I think this is an objectively good movie, but, and here's where you can go and write your comment to disagree, I don't think it does anything particularly great. The best part of this movie is sneaking through the Death Star and rescuing Princess Leia. I know that this is just me, but I find that the third act is pretty boring compared to the rest of the movie. Not from a VFX standpoint or anything like that, because all of this holds up incredibly well, but the whole Death Star trench run thing just doesn't really do it for me. It never really has, and this is where I'll take that lens off and say that even as a kid, the whole space battle was just the worst part of the movie for me. I understand that that's an unpopular opinion, but having our heroes battle to get to the princess and barely make it out, not even with everybody that they went there with, sets up the Death Star and the Empire to be this great threat. And while there's stakes in the final battle of the film, it just doesn't hit as hard for me because I find it a bit too unbelievable. And that was something that I got from this recent viewing. But I'll get to more on that later on. Overall, this is a very solid film. Watching this again without my nostalgia goggles on has changed my mind on a few things, and maybe I've just heard so much about this film from my time at film school that watching it again, I expected it to blow me away, and I did feel a breeze, but not as much as I thought I would've. This movie does absolutely nothing wrong. It hits all the good beats that you'd want from it, but I think it's missing that it factor that another movie in this video really gets right. So this movie is a 9 out of 10. Does everything really, really well, but nothing great. Fight me all you want after the video, just listen to what I have to say about this next one first. So we move on to the highest regarded piece of Star Wars media from everyone. The critics loved this movie, the fans love this one, and regardless of what era you love the most, everybody can agree that Empire Strikes Back is absolutely amazing. So I watched it again, and I was surprised because after all this time, this is still definitely the best Star Wars movie. While you might be angry about what I said with A New Hope because of how simple it is, Empire Strikes Back is anything but simple. This sequel is bigger, better, it has higher stakes, better pacing, more entertainment value, and is all around just the better film. Clearly, some time has passed between these characters. Their relationships have developed more off-screen, and their characters as individuals have grown quite a bit. Luke now has telekinetic powers, Han and Leia have some sort of will they, won't they romance going on, Han is now a general for the rebels, and R2 still hates 3PO. We also have this new setting at the start of the film. Instead of a barren, sandy, and hot wasteland, we have a barren, snowy, and cold wasteland. But we also see just how screwed the rebels are. The Empire has all the resources, all the power, and the rebels are holding on by duct tape and string. The Battle of Hoth is incredible, so are all the events leading up to it with Luke that sets up his own journey, and because of how much we care about the other characters like Han, Leia, and Chewie, they're able to hold their own plotline in the film without the central character. And to prove to you that I don't just hate space battles, I think that Luke's point of view with the snowspeeder is great, and everything involving the Millennium Falcon escaping from the Empire is amazing. Alright, so you happy now? This film actively avoids trying to do what worked in the last film. We have a big space station, a forest planet, a desert planet, and a very structured story with a gang of unwilling companions. In this film, we have a snowy planet, a jungle swamp, a cloud city. Wait, that's just what it's actually called. But all of this is vastly different from the first film, which is another reason why I loved this film and this era in general. Because this film is actively trying to expand the world. There is a whole galaxy out there. It's called Star Wars, a war among the stars. So obviously there would be so many different kinds of planets and biomes for our characters to travel to, so this film achieves that. Not only are there new planets, but there's new characters to meet as well, like Jedi Master Yoda. So with Yoda, it was really hard to view him as this character I had never seen before. I'm so used to lightsaber Yoda, Jedi Master Yoda during the Clone Wars, and everything that happened there, so when I see Yoda, that's the Yoda that I see. But I tried to watch this film like I had never seen it before, and with that lens, this little green gremlin looks anything but a Jedi Master. We've seen Ben Kenobi, who was this wide, old, human mentor, and now we're supposed to believe a goblin is even more powerful than him and can continue Luke's training? But this film leans into that aspect, and when we see Yoda's abilities and knowledge of the Force, we as an audience finally believe in him and think of him as an even wiser Jedi Master than Ben Kenobi. Watching this movie again, I can say with absolute certainty that my favorite scene in the film is when Luke fights this vision of Vader on Dagobah, only to win and see that his deepest fear is to become exactly like Vader. This scene, for one, makes me laugh now because it confused me so much as a kid. I had no idea how Luke could defeat Vader here and then him be alive in the next scene and not defeat him later. I don't know, my kid brain was weird, but this scene works on so many different levels. For one, we see that Luke's greatest fear truly is how his powers and arrogance are kind of getting to him, but it's also foreshadowing to later on in the film. We also meet Lando, who is Han Solo but in a different font, and also reminds us a lot of who Han was in the previous movie and how different he is now. I've also always held a grudge against Lando, because everybody always talks about how great he is, but as a kid I really loved Han Solo, and to see him tortured because of Lando's trap just made me instantly dislike Lando. But watching it now, I'm amazed at how much Lando is able to accomplish in such a short amount of time. We really don't meet him until late into the second act of the film, and for him to go on a character arc of his own in that time and also become an audience favorite is impressive, and I've forgiven him just a bit. This also has a much darker tone than the first film. In A New Hope, the hero learns stuff, defeats the bad guys at the end, gets the medal, and everything is a-okay. Empire Strikes Back isn't like that at all. Luke continues to learn how to be a Jedi, but leaves against the wishes of Yoda, and we think that everything is going to be okay because Luke was okay in the last one, he saved the day, but it doesn't end that way. Luke doesn't save the day, the Empire really does strike back. In this case, it's against a character that we care about, Han Solo, and the good guys lose at the end of the day. Of course, I have to mention what I think is the best twist in all of Star Wars, and even cinema for that matter, that being Darth Vader revealed to be Luke's father. Watching this again, I was looking for any sort of indication or foreshadowing to this scene, and outside of the Dagobah vision, there really isn't too much. It makes the scene that much more unbelievable, and also makes you question everything that we've seen out of this series so far. Is Obi-Wan to be trusted? Is Yoda? And is this even real? There's also a lot of mysteries set up in this film for them to be held off as cliffhangers. We get a glimpse at what Vader looks like underneath the mask, we see the evil Emperor for the first time, Yoda says that there's another Jedi out there, and of course Han is in the hands of the enemy. There's really not a lot of resolution for these plots, but there is a lot of character development, which I think separates a good ending from a bad ending. If you want to have a cliffhanger, you at least need to leave the characters off in a different mindset from where they were at the start of the film. Luke realizes that he's not capable of handling Vader on his own, and his entire world is shaken to the core with the revelation of Vader being his father. Cliffhangers nowadays are usually used as a cheap way to try and get people to click on the next episode, but that's not what the cliffhanger is here. There's so many different ways this movie sets up the sequel while also telling a full and complete story on its own. And I think that is the most impressive thing about this movie, even with all of the other accolades and praises it receives. This movie is a 10 out of 10. It's one of the best sequels ever made, one of the best movies ever made. Star Wars hasn't reached a high this high since this movie came out, and that's coming from a hardcore prequel fan. There's also this sort of love triangle between Luke, Han, and Leia. And I know that Leia told Han she loves him, but now that he's out of the picture, I'm rooting for Luke and Leia, barring some crazy twist that wouldn't make them a good couple. I think that's where the story's heading. Let's find out, shall we? The final episode of the trilogy, here's where we're going to see all the resolution, the characters at their best, and what should be the best film in the trilogy, right? Well, kinda. Most trilogies are lucky to have one good movie. A few are lucky to have the second movie be the best movie. Very rarely is the third movie the best in the trilogy. Most of the time, the third movie is an absolute abomination compared to the first two. Return of the Jedi, thankfully, isn't that last case, but it's also not the best film in the trilogy either. We get to see Luke, now a fully trained Jedi, return to his former home, showing us how different he truly is, and now he's got a green lightsaber, so you know he's different. We get the gang back together, take down Jabba the Hutt, so the real threat can present itself. We have, let's see here, another Death Star, this time with even more flaws than before. Well, we're gonna need help from the galaxy in order to take out this threat. Let's see who we got here. Oh, we have little teddy bear people. This movie, removing nostalgia goggles, has a few issues. But even with nostalgia goggles on, this movie has some of my favorite moments in all of Star Wars. This movie feels more like it borrows the structure from The Empire Strikes Back, but has the same level of lightheartedness as A New Hope, if not more so. The Ewoks are a particularly polarizing subject, and compared to some of the other stuff that's been made for toy purchasing purposes, the Ewoks aren't that bad. As a kid, I freaking loved the Ewoks, and as a species themselves, they do add to the universe and this forest moon of Endor. I'm not gonna knock the movie for going back to Tatooine. It follows through on some scenes set up in the previous films, it's a nice callback to the original film, and it's Luke's former home. The forest moon of Endor is a very cool planet. Sure, it's just a forest, and maybe it's similar to Yavin 4, but it's also different enough that the planets don't just look exactly the same. I think a lot of this film, in regards to the universe, adds a lot, but it also doesn't take any huge risks like the previous film did. There's now a green lightsaber, the Emperor is the one behind the curtain pulling the strings, a new planet, some new vehicles, and that's really it. The cracks were definitely starting to form with this movie because Star Wars was becoming such a popular franchise. There were a lot of different ways what happens in the story could influence how much money was made from merchandise. This led to new outfits for our characters, cute, cuddly, and deadly teddy bears for kids, and it almost seemed like there was less care and effort put forth in this film. I actually found some of the visual effects to be a bit dated, which is weird because I didn't feel that way with the first two. Some of the performances seemed like they were there just to get a paycheck, and above all, I just didn't feel as captivated by this movie and a lot of the Endor scenes in particular. But what I did feel captivated by was Luke's story. Seeing Luke become a fully grown Jedi Knight from being a farm boy in the first movie is an excellent and interesting character arc. He goes to visit Yoda to hear if Vader is really his father, which he is, gets some clarity from Obi-Wan, and knows that now if he wants to save his friends, he's gonna have to defeat his own father. But what about that other Jedi that Yoda mentioned? It's a girl, and it's Luke's sister? Well, there's really only been one girl in this whole series. Surely it can't be.
Leia's my sister.
That's gross.
Oh, well, I definitely was not rooting for them to get together. That's just absurd and gross. Everything involving Luke in this film really separates it from just being a standard third entry to a worthy finale of the franchise. He proves to himself, the Jedi Order, and the audience what a hero really is. He brings Anakin back from the dark side because of it. Vader kills Palpatine, at least I'm guessing he does, because surely nobody can survive this, and they share a nice moment before Anakin passes away. The Rebels win, and the whole galaxy is happy because of it. Luke's character arc throughout the trilogy is still the best depiction of what a Jedi truly is, choosing peace over violence when the moment truly matters, and because of it, the whole galaxy is saved. Oh, and Lando also destroys the second Death Star. I always forget about that one. Return of the Jedi is a good ending to the trilogy. On its own, it's a fine movie, but it's also not great. Whereas A New Hope did everything perfectly good, Empire Strikes Back did everything perfectly great, Return of the Jedi does some stuff good and some stuff great. Might be an unpopular opinion, but I'll give Return of the Jedi an 8 out of 10. And that was the original era for a while. But then, the dark times came. After the success of the Clone Wars, a series that further explored the adventures of our lead characters from the prequel trilogy, Dave Filoni continued his work in animation, this time in the original trilogy era with a show called Star Wars Rebels. But instead of focusing on our heroes from that era, we focused on several new heroes, with the ones that we love coming in for cameos every now and then. This show took place between episodes 3 and 4, so right as the Rebel cause was really starting to become a thing, and it certainly changed this era in a number of ways. In the original trilogy, we were under the impression that Luke, Obi-Wan, and Yoda were the only remaining Jedi, with Luke and possibly Leia being the sole remaining Jedi at the end of the trilogy. But that wasn't true. Or I guess it was,
from a certain point of view.
Because this series introduced us to Kanan Jarrus, a Jedi Padawan that survived Order 66. Ezra Bridger, a Force-sensitive kid that Kanan would make his own Padawan. We were reintroduced to Ahsoka Tano, who I guess isn't technically a Jedi, and then there were all these Inquisitors, who wielded flying lightsaber blades, but they also weren't technically a Sith because of the Rule of Two. So I mean, I guess Luke is technically the only Jedi Knight, but he's far from the last Force-having, lightsaber-wielding individual even by the end of this show. Rebels was not the Clone Wars, and personally, I say that with a bit of disdain. The art style is different, which doesn't bother me as much as it does other people, but it also looks noticeably cheaper than the art style of the Clone Wars. The story is more or less very much a Disney Star Wars story. Each episode, like the Clone Wars before it, is part of a multi-episode arc, and sometimes these arcs feel impactful and special, but most of the time it's just an adventure with a ragtag group of characters who overcome the Empire time and time again. I feel so conflicted with Rebels whenever I watch it because I always feel there's flashes of greatness. The characters do genuinely interest me and I grew to care for them over the course of the series, but I also feel like most of the stories being told throughout the series are a watered down version of what the creators actually wanted to do. But then there's episodes like Twilight of the Apprentice and Twin Suns, which are some of my favorite Star Wars content ever made. This honestly kind of reminds me of how I feel about Return of the Jedi in a lot of ways. There's some very high highs, and then there's a lot of mediocre to okay stuff in between. I always wondered what this show could have been like if it was given the same budget and less restrictions that the Clone Wars had. I'd love it if we got the same art style, not because I'm super bothered by the Rebels art style, but to give the animated side of Star Wars a more cohesive style like it's the same story. I also wondered what an animated show could have been like if instead of this Rebels crew, we got the characters that we know and love, just like the Clone Wars did. This comes with its own set of issues, especially in the context of the Star Wars universe today. Clone Wars is set in between episodes 2 and 3, but if they set this hypothetical show in between episodes 5 and 6, then Han Solo wouldn't be in it. So what about episodes 4 and 5? Yeah, they could do that, but they'd also be so limited with Luke Skywalker because they couldn't show him using any crazy Force powers, so that would end up being a rather limited show with the stories that they could tell. So what about after episode 6? That would definitely be the best time to do it, right? And I certainly think so, but with Disney now telling so many different stories in that era, before the sequels, but after the originals, this would also turn into a pretty limited series with what they could do. But I guess it's still possible. Anyways, back to Rebels, I think that this show has flashes of greatness, some moments even better than the Clone Wars, but there's also a ton of mediocrity. And that's a shame because I don't think there's any one person to blame for that. There's a giant thing to blame for it, but I still enjoyed what we got. I just wish it could have been better. 7.5 out of 10 for having most episodes be like a 6 out of 10, but some being complete 10 out of 10s. To this day, I think that Rogue One might be the best received piece of Star Wars that Disney has given to us, and for that matter, that we've gotten since the release of Empire Strikes Back. I thought that everybody loved The Mandalorian, but after season 3, people are, rightfully so, kind of turning on it. Everybody does love Andor, so there's that, but that's also just kind of an extension of Rogue One. I don't think anyone had any issues whatsoever with Obi-Wan Kenobi, so maybe that's the one that everybody can agree to like the most. But Rogue One is very special in a lot of ways. This movie feels the most mature out of anything since, well, The Empire Strikes Back. There's a lot of great things to take from this film. We got to see the darker side of the rebellion, showing us that there's heroes and villains on both sides. We were introduced to great new characters that we could care for despite knowing how all of this is going to end for them. We got what might be the best post-Lucas interpretation of Darth Vader, and not even just the hallway scene, but all of his scenes are just fantastic. A cast that is filled to the brim with stars that put on great performances, a nice retro look that truly makes this film seem like a prequel to the original trilogy. The action is great, the new planets are cool and unique, and overall this is a very adult-oriented Star Wars film. But, and there is a but, this also seemed to be the origin for a lot of the mistakes that Disney would later go on to make. They're small in this movie, but they're also the groundwork for what a lot of people take issue with in the current days of Star Wars. What exactly am I talking about? Two things really, that is course correction and nostalgia bait. So many people over the years took issue with the way that the Death Star was constructed. Who's the guy that would make a self-destruct button on the most deadly space station that surely cost like trillions of credits to make? Like, what was this architect thinking? Well, since you guys pointed out a plot hole, Disney was like, what if the architect made that on purpose? Yeah, that works, let's go with that. And how would the audience react to a cast of new characters? Well, maybe they won't like them all that much, so we gotta make sure there's cameos from Darth Vader, Peter Cushing's Grand Moff Tarkin, who's dead, but that's not a problem for us, and Princess Leia to end the movie. Now, even when the movie came out, there was a lot of talk about the Tarkin and Leia cameos, especially the ethics around using Peter Cushing's likeness from CGI, but seeing Leia was cool, and Vader was of course the best part of the movie. But he also wasn't originally in it, at least not in the capacity that we've seen here. Rogue One underwent extensive reshoots. In the trailer, you can see clips from plot lines that were entirely cut from the movie or reworked to play out differently. Reshoots are usually never a good thing on any production. We've all heard and seen the horror stories from reshoots like Justice League, The New Mutants, Dark Phoenix, Suicide Squad, Solo, the list goes on, and for most films, reshoots aren't the thing that fixes bad reception to a film. But Rogue One had some reshoots, and among those reshoots was the famous Vader hallway scene. This is admittedly a phenomenal scene, and to this day it's one of the best in all of Star Wars, but this also showed Disney that maybe they were the correct ones when it came to the direction of the movies. They knew what they were talking about. To hell with the director's vision. We want to make money, and the way we make money is showing people characters they love, little cameos to get butts in the theater, and if there's a plot hole, we'll just fix it by adding in a new story. So eventually, Star Wars will become this perfect franchise, and everybody will love it, and if they don't, to hell with the fans, cause we're still making a boatload of money. This is the thinking that has Star Wars where it's at today. Gone are the days of a well thought out storyline with complete character arcs and satisfying conclusions so that way the fans are happy. If there's a problem, we'll just correct it with a new piece of Star Wars media, and in that new piece of media, we'll make sure it's filled with cameos and appearances from loved characters so that way it'll get people to keep on watching. I know everybody loved Rogue One, but the problems really started here. Maybe you can argue they started before that in Rebels, but compared to Rogue One, Rebels had a much smaller audience. So this movie was really the first test for Disney to see what they could get away with, and because they got away with so much here and people loved it, that trend continued on, and now we're here today, where just about everything is somehow connected to another aspect of the universe because there's no Star Wars without Skywalker attached to it in some way, shape, or form. But on its own, Rogue One is a great film. And I'm not going to take anything away from that. This is an 8.5 out of 10, one of the Star Wars movies that I go back to and watch pretty frequently. Watching all these films again with an objective point of view, or at least as objective as I can possibly be, has opened my eyes to a lot of the criticisms on the Star Wars universe, and how those same criticisms people judge the Disney stuff on doesn't really apply here. I know I kind of just went on a Disney rant in the Rogue One segment, and I'm not here to defend them now, but I have to point out a few things that I feel like Star Wars fans are super hypocritical of. A lot of people cannot view the original trilogy and the original era as anything but perfect, and I'm not really judging anyone on that. I feel the same way about the prequels in a lot of ways, but when you try to reason with logic as to why or how things happen in the Star Wars universe, you cannot just eliminate the original trilogy from that same flow of logic, and a lot of people do. Let's start off small. In episode 4, we learn that Han Solo owes money to this Jabba the Hutt guy. In the original, not digitally remastered version, Jabba the Hutt really is just a guy. He's not this slimy, grotesque monster, but in Return of the Jedi, he's the Jabba that we all know and love? Could you imagine the outrage if in like episode 7, Rey's boss was this hideous blob, and then we saw him again in episode 9 and it's just like Ryan Gosling? People would be up in arms about the continuity, but that wasn't a problem with the original trilogy, mostly because they re-edited the scene, hence adding in more content to fill in the gaps, but that's just a small one. A huge complaint about Rey is that she's a character with no flaws and can do everything that she tries to do without any problems, and that's true. That's definitely a valid criticism. But let's just focus on episode 7 right now. Everybody thinks it's so unbelievable that Rey could defeat an injured Kylo Ren in the final battle because she's had no training. And a day ago, she was just a scavenger on a desert planet. If you ask me, I think it's far more unbelievable for a guy to blow up a deadly space station with no training, who was also a farm boy a day ago. But you might say Luke was tapping into the Force, that's how he did it. But guess what? So was Rey during her fight with Kylo Ren. I'm not a huge sequel defender either, but you can't have it both ways. You can't criticize Rey for having no training and then praise Luke for blowing up the Death Star. And that's just me looking at it objectively. There's also the reveal of Luke and Leia being siblings, or the lack of a reveal. Now, this might just come down to the time period that the film was made in, but I also don't think it's that. You have a crazy and intense reveal of Vader being Luke's father, and in the next movie, Yoda says that you have a sister, and Luke's just like, who's the only girl that I know? Oh, it's Leia. This just seemed like an incredibly lazy way to reveal this information. Whenever there was a grand reveal of this scale in any sort of the Disney era content, it was at least treated with some weight behind it. If this was the reveal of Luke and Leia being siblings today, people would say that it came out of nowhere, it's just in the film to have some kind of twist. Sure, it was set up when Yoda said that there is another Jedi, but the execution of the scene is honestly pretty lackluster. There's also the plot of Return of the Jedi in general. What can they do to top the Death Star? How about an even bigger one? Now, this is a point that actually gets a fair bit of criticism from both ends. In Rise of Skywalker, they wanted to top Starkiller Planet, so they had a legion of Star Destroyers with Death Star capabilities. This just seemed like a cop-out to raise the stakes even more, a point that most Star Wars fans can agree is similar to the aspect of the bigger Death Star in Return of the Jedi. So good job on that one, most of you Star Wars fans, but there's this flow of logic that people try to rationalize to say different movies are good or bad, but a lot of those same criticisms are not talked about in the original era. It's like they're held to a different standard, and you can't have your cake and eat it too. But looking at this era as a whole, how does it stack up against the rest of the franchise? As this was most people's introduction to Star Wars, the original era holds up incredibly well. This era makes the universe feel incredibly massive and incredibly dangerous. The Empire is everywhere, and there's a very real David versus Goliath feel to this whole era. No matter the planet, there's always some sort of danger, whether that be people, the Empire, or just the life on the planet itself, and that's part of what made Star Wars feel so special. The different planets and creatures that you'd find were all unique to that planet that the characters were on. The sense of scale, whether that be different ships or battles that the rebels were engaged with, was always incredibly lopsided. The Empire had these giant space stations, star destroyers, insane amounts of stormtroopers, and the rebels had these little rinky-dink ships. Nothing ever seemed to go in their favor, and it was up to the characters to outsmart the enemy to get the upper hand. So that brings us to the characters, not just the ones from the original trilogy, but the characters in this entire era. We have the Rogue One crew, who were fighting against insurmountable odds, giving each of their lives to a cause that many thought was already lost, but through their friendships and individual arcs, we learned to care for each of them and root for them, because without them, the rebels would have never won. The Rebels crew, while definitely aimed for a younger demographic, each have standout characteristics that make them multi-dimensional characters. Kanan wants to train Ezra, though he has this inner conflict with himself because even he never finished his training, so how could he possibly be a good master to somebody else? We learn about the backstories of characters like Hera and Sabine, learning to care about them and their personal journeys. Ezra is conflicted about being a Jedi, and how could he possibly make any difference in the galaxy, getting torn between darkness and light, but ultimately making a sacrifice that would save the galaxy. At least for a few years. And at the center of it all are the characters Luke, Han, and Leia. If not for the sacrifices that some of these other characters made, Luke wouldn't have been able to get through to Vader. They wouldn't have been able to destroy the Death Star twice, and the rebels would never have come out on top. The whole message of this era, and to Star Wars as a whole in some cases, is to never stop fighting for what you believe in. Leia and the rebels believe that they can bring peace to the galaxy if they destroy the Empire. Luke believes in the good of Vader, that he isn't too far gone, and that the right choice will always prevail in the end. The Rogue One crew gave their lives for just a fighting chance, and the Rebels crew prevented the Empire from being an even bigger force to be reckoned with. Wars come with sacrifice, and the victor isn't always perfect, but they also offer something different from all those impacted by the war. And as cheesy as it sounds, the power of friendship always dominates the power of fear and darkness. That's what Star Wars is truly about, rooting for the underdog, still fighting when you believe all hope is lost, and working together to see the result that you want. That's why Star Wars is so comforting for a lot of people. The good guys ultimately win at the end of the story. The whole saga, episodes 1 to 6, paint a picture of the small bits of good and hope that shine through the darkness of the Empire. But at the end of it all, a better world emerges and everyone is happy, until we're eventually told the exact same story again. So those are my thoughts on the original era of Star Wars. You might not agree with everything that I said. In fact, I know you don't, so feel free to tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like this. I've got a few more Star Wars eras to get through, so I'll see you guys in the next one.
Yeah.